The first reports emerged not from a government statement, but from the flickering glow of smartphones capturing the night sky over Isfahan. The explosions, described by witnesses as a series of thunderous cracks that reverberated through the ancient city, were initially attributed to a routine air defense exercise. But within hours, the veneer of normalcy was shattered. Iranian state television, in a terse and trembling announcement, confirmed what the world had dreaded. A precision strike had targeted a key military installation deep within the heart of the country. An act of aggression Tehran swiftly attributed to a coordinated operation by the United States and Israel. The carefully managed shadow war, fought for years in cyberspace and through proxies, had just been dragged into the blinding light of direct confrontation, sending a shockwave of dread across a region already teetering on the brink. The retaliation, when it came, was not the immediate, overwhelming barrage some analysts had predicted, but something perhaps more calculated and, in its own way, more terrifying. 48 hours after the Isfahan strike, Iran launched a massive, multi-pronged attack not from its own soil, but through its network of regional proxies. From southern Lebanon, Hezbollah unleashed a volley of precision-guided missiles toward Israeli military positions in the Galilee. Simultaneously, Shiite militias in Syria and Iraq fired barrages toward the Golan Heights, while Houthi forces in Yemen launched long-range drones toward the southern Israeli port of Eilat. It was a message of encirclement, a demonstration that Iran could bleed its enemies on multiple fronts without firing a single shot from its own territory, a tactic designed to maximize chaos while minimizing direct accountability. The sheer scale of the proxy barrage overwhelmed even the most sophisticated air defense networks. While the Iron Dome and David's sling systems intercepted the majority of the projectiles, several breaches were reported. A military base in the Golan Heights sustained significant damage, with reports of casualties that military sensors struggled to contain. In the occupied West Bank, settlers rushed to shelters as sirens wailed across the landscape, a sound that has become the grim soundtrack of existence in this land. The images broadcast across the world, of families huddled in stairwells, of orange flames licking at the night sky from a struck fuel depot, of Israeli fighter jets screaming low over the Mediterranean, painted a portrait of a nation under a multi-front assault unlike any it had faced in decades. In Washington, the Situation Room was activated within minutes of the first confirmed impacts. President Trump, having authorized the initial strike alongside Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, now faced the incendiary aftermath. Official statements from the White House spoke of measured resolve and the inherent right of self-defense, but the behind-the-scenes negotiations were frantic. Calls were placed to Riyadh, to Abu Dhabi, to Cairo, any capital that might help contain the inferno. The carefully constructed architecture of the Abraham Accords, designed to isolate Iran, suddenly seemed fragile as Arab capitals nervously watched the conflagration at their doorstep, fearful of being caught in the crossfire between the Persian giant and the Western-backed regional power. The Israeli Security Cabinet convened in a bunker beneath Jerusalem, the atmosphere described by participants as electric with tension. The Hawks, led by the Minister of Defense, demanded an immediate and disproportionate response, a decapitating strike against Iranian nuclear facilities or the assassination of a senior Revolutionary Guard commander. The more cautious voices, including the head of Mossad, warned of the unknown variables. What was the true extent of Iran's capability? How would Russia, now deeply embedded in the region, react? And crucially, what was the red line that would trigger an all-out region-wide war that no one could win? The silence that followed the Prime Minister's demand for options was, by all accounts, heavier than the bombs that had just fallen. To understand the precipice upon which the region now stood, one must rewind through the decades of accumulated grievances. The 1979 Islamic Revolution transformed Iran from a Western ally into an avowed enemy, viewing the United States as the Great Satan and Israel as an illegitimate entity on Muslim land. The 8-year war with Iraq in the 1980s, during which Western powers backed Saddam Hussein, cemented Tehran's worldview of a hostile international order. Israel, for its part, watched the rise of a theocratic state with nuclear ambitions as an existential threat, launching a covert war of assassinations, cyber attacks, and sabotage against Iran's nuclear program, a campaign of shadow warfare that kept the conflict simmering just below the boil for 2 decades. The nuclear dimension has always been the radioactive core of this conflict. Iran insists its program is for peaceful energy purposes, a claim met with deep skepticism by the International Atomic Energy Agency and Western intelligence services, who have documented past efforts to weaponize enrichment. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action of 2015, which traded sanctions relief for nuclear restrictions, was the high watermark of diplomacy. a fragile dam holding back the flood of war. But the dam was shattered in 2018 when the Trump administration unilaterally withdrew from the deal, pursuing a policy of maximum pressure designed to cripple Iran's economy and force it to capitulate. Instead, the policy pushed Iran to accelerate its nuclear program, enriching uranium to unprecedented levels and bringing it closer than ever to the threshold of a bomb. The period between the U.S. withdrawal from the nuclear deal and the current crisis was a dark tapestry of escalating provocations. Tankers were mysteriously mined in the Gulf of Oman. Saudi oil facilities were crippled by drone strikes. The United States assassinated General Qasem Soleimani, the revered commander of the Quds Force, in a drone strike at Baghdad airport, an act that brought the region to the very edge of war. Iran responded by launching ballistic missiles at U.S. bases in Iraq, carefully calibrated to cause maximum shock without massive casualties, a warning shot that demonstrated both its reach and its restraint. Each side probed the other's defenses, testing the limits of escalation, building an increasingly combustible pile of kindling. The Israeli strategy has long been to fight Iran between the wars, a doctrine of continuous, low-level operations designed to degrade the enemy's capabilities without triggering a full-scale conflict. This has meant thousands of airstrikes in Syria against Iranian weapons shipments to Hezbollah, the covert introduction of the Stuxnet computer worm into Iranian centrifuges, and the targeted killings of nuclear scientists on the streets of Tehran. This shadow war was the safety valve, allowing for aggression without the accountability of open warfare. The Isfahan strike, however, appears to have crossed a line that Tehran had drawn in the sand, a direct, publicly acknowledged attack on its sovereign territory, which demanded a response that could not be confined to the shadows. Iran's retaliatory strategy through its proxies is a masterpiece of asymmetric warfare, honed over decades of confrontation with technologically superior foes. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has built a network of Shiite militias across the region, from the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces to the Yemeni Houthis, each equipped with increasingly sophisticated missiles and drones. This Ring of Fire, as it is known in Tehran, allows Iran to project power and threaten its enemies without engaging its own conventional forces. By activating this network simultaneously, Iran demonstrated that it could turn the entire Middle East into a battlefield, forcing Israel to fight a multi-front war of attrition that would bleed its economy and its morale. The human toll of this escalation is already mounting in ways that are not captured by casualty counts. In the border towns of northern Israel, the constant drone of warning sirens has emptied streets and schools, sending residents fleeing south in a mass displacement unseen since the 2006 Lebanon war. In Lebanon, already crippled by economic collapse, the prospect of another Israeli retaliation against Hezbollah threatens to plunge the nation into an abyss of destruction. The whispers in the souks of Beirut and Damascus speak of a collective dread, a feeling that the region's history of sudden catastrophic violence is about to repeat itself, dragging a new generation into the inferno that their parents endured. Global capitals have been thrust into a frantic diplomatic overdrive. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session, a ritual of powerlessness in the face of raw military force. The rhetoric was familiar, calls for restraint, for de-escalation, for a return to the negotiating table. But the words rang hollow against the sound of explosions. The European Union, desperately trying to maintain relevance, shuttled envoys between Tehran and Jerusalem, offering economic incentives for calm. Russia and China, wielding their veto power in the Security Council, blocked any resolution that condemned Iran, framing the crisis as a consequence of American adventurism and insisting that the root cause, the assassination of Iranian scientists and the sabotage of its facilities, be addressed. The role of the Arab states in this crisis is perhaps the most complex and fraught. The Gulf monarchies, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, have spent years building bridges with Israel, viewing the Jewish state as a crucial partner against the shared threat of Iran. But their populations remain deeply sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and hostile to Israeli military action. The sight of Israeli flags flying over diplomatic missions in Abu Dhabi now seems like a provocation. These fragile governments are caught in an impossible vice. Siding too closely with Israel risks inflaming domestic unrest, while distancing themselves from the U.S.-led coalition risks losing their security umbrella. Their survival now depends on walking a tightrope over a canyon of fire. The energy markets, the lifeblood of the global economy, have reacted with predictable hysteria. Oil prices spiked to their highest levels in a decade, breaching $120 a barrel as traders priced in the risk of a broader conflict that could choke the Strait of Hormuz, through which a fifth of the world's petroleum passes. The specter of another oil shock, reminiscent of the 1970s, haunts the chancelleries of Europe and Asia. If Iran were to follow through on its long-standing threat to close the strait, the global economy would be plunged into a recession, the cost of living crisis would deepen, and the political stability of governments from London to Tokyo would be severely tested. Amidst this geopolitical hurricane, the United States faces a strategic conundrum of its own making. The maximum pressure campaign designed to weaken Iran has instead accelerated its nuclear program and hardened its resolve. The withdrawal from the region, a key promise of the Trump administration, has now been reversed, with American troops and assets surging back into the Gulf. The USS Nimitz and its carrier strike group have been ordered to remain on station, and additional Patriot missile batteries are being rushed to allied capitals. The United States finds itself once again deeply enmeshed in a Middle Eastern conflict, its prestige and power on the line in a region it desperately wanted to leave. The internal dynamics within Iran are equally volatile. The regime faces a restive population weary of economic hardship, political repression, and the endless cycle of confrontation with the West. The massive protests that rocked the country in recent years, sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini, revealed deep cracks in the regime's legitimacy. A full-scale war with Israel and the United States could be a catastrophic gamble for the clerics, but it could also serve as a powerful tool for national unity, rallying the population around the flag against an external enemy. The Revolutionary Guard, which sees itself as the defender of the revolution, has been pushing for a more aggressive posture, viewing restraint as a sign of weakness that emboldens its enemies. Israel's calculus is perhaps the most urgent. The multi-front attack orchestrated by Iran has exposed the limits of its deterrence doctrine. For decades, Israel has relied on the threat of overwhelming retaliation to keep its borders quiet. But the current barrage, launched from Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, suggests that its enemies are no longer deterred. The quiet that prevailed for years was not peace, but the calm before a far more complex and dangerous storm. The Israeli leadership understands that it cannot tolerate a situation where its population is held hostage to Iranian proxy fire, yet a ground invasion of Lebanon or a direct strike on Iran carries risks that could spiral into a catastrophic multi-year war. Expert analysis from retired generals and intelligence officials paints a grim picture of the military realities. Iran's proxy network is not just a collection of militias, but a sophisticated, integrated military command equipped with an arsenal of over 150,000 rockets and missiles, many of which are precision-guided. A full-scale Israeli-Hezbollah war would likely see thousands of projectiles raining down on Tel Aviv and Haifa daily, overwhelming air defenses and causing mass casualties. The Israeli economy would grind to a halt, and the home front would become a battlefront. This is the nightmare scenario that has kept Israeli generals awake at night for years, and it is now the baseline reality they must confront. The nuclear clock is ticking louder than ever. With the region in flames, the last vestiges of diplomacy have evaporated. Iran's nuclear advances, once a bargaining chip, are now a shield. There's a growing belief in Tehran that only the possession of a nuclear weapon can guarantee the regime's survival against an implacable enemy. The Israeli government, facing existential rhetoric from its adversaries, views a nuclear-armed Iran as an unacceptable final red line. The whispers in Jerusalem are no longer about if they will strike Iran's nuclear facilities, but when and at what cost. A preventive strike would plunge the region into a war of unimaginable proportions, drawing in the United States and potentially triggering a global conflagration. The global consequences extend far beyond the Middle East. The conflict has already inflamed tensions in Europe, where Muslim and Jewish communities eye each other with suspicion. Security services are on high alert for terrorist attacks inspired by the war. The flow of refugees, already a source of political turmoil in Europe, could swell into the millions if the conflict expands, destabilizing neighboring countries like Turkey and Jordan. The international rules-based order, already battered by the war in Ukraine, faces its ultimate test. Can the world's powers contain a regional war that directly implicates two of its most volatile and heavily armed players, or will they be dragged inexorably into the vortex? Looking toward the future, the scenarios range from bad to catastrophic. The most optimistic path involves intense back-channel diplomacy, perhaps mediated by Qatar or Oman, leading to an informal understanding. Iran halts its proxy attacks in exchange for a cessation of Israeli strikes on its territory and a relaxation of some sanctions. But this seems a distant hope, given the level of blood that has been shed. The more likely scenario is a protracted war of attrition, a grinding conflict with no clear end, where the region bleeds slowly, punctuated by moments of intense violence that threaten to boil over into something far worse. The role of domestic politics in Israel and the United States cannot be overstated. In Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu, facing corruption trials and political fragility, has long been viewed by critics as having a personal interest in prolonging conflict. A wartime leader often enjoys a suspension of domestic political challenges. In the United States, President Trump, facing an election, sees the crisis as both a threat and an opportunity. It allows him to project strength and rally patriotic support, but it also risks an October surprise of escalating violence that could sway voters unpredictably. The intersection of geopolitics and domestic political calendars adds a volatile human element to an already unstable equation. For the ordinary people of the Middle East, the crisis represents yet another chapter in a long history of suffering. In the cafes of Beirut, the hookah smoke mingles with the smoke of anxiety. In the markets of Tehran, merchants calculate not just their profits, but how many days of food they can store. In the kindergartens of Tel Aviv, children practice running to shelters with a grim proficiency that breaks the heart of every parent. They are the silent majority, the ones who will pay the price for the decisions made in bunkers and situation rooms, their lives disrupted, their futures uncertain, their dreams deferred by the endless march of geopolitics. As the sun sets over a region on edge, the only certainty is uncertainty. The old rules of engagement, the shadow wars, the covert operations, the plausible deniability, all of it has been incinerated in the fireball of open confrontation. Iran has demonstrated it can bleed its enemies. Israel has demonstrated it will not be cowed. The United States has demonstrated its commitment to its ally, but also its profound inability to control the situation. The Middle East, that ancient cradle of civilization, now finds itself in the cradle of a new world war, trembling on the edge of an abyss, waiting to see who will take the next step into the void.